Hello, everybody. The webinar will begin very shortly. We'll just take a few moments while everybody joins the call, and we will begin in a few moments' time. So good morning, everybody, from a very chilly London. Great to have you all with us here today for the third in our series of How Whitehall Works webinars. In our first two series, we looked at kind of what civil servants do, who they are, where power lies. In the second one, we looked at the culture across government and the civil service and ethics and accountability. And today we're going to be looking at kind of the how Whitehall operates, how you take a policy idea right from the kind of conception of that idea right through Parliament into legislation and then out so that it is delivered to make a difference on the ground. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former civil servant. I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar today. On behalf of Global Government Forum, we work with civil servants and public servants all around the world. We're going to be looking, as I said, at kind of three key areas. So the policy process within Whitehall, how policy gets developed, then the policy idea through to legislation, and then from legislation to delivery. And I have two great experts with me here today who are going to help talk us through those three areas. In a moment, I'll introduce our two speakers. But just to say, really, we want this to be a conversation. So we want you, the audience, to get involved throughout the whole of today's webinar. So whichever device you are using, you should see a Q&A function on your device. Please use that button, that Q&A function, to send in your questions and your comments throughout the webinar. So don't wait until the end of the conversation, because we'll keep coming back to those questions as we go through the sections of our webinar today. So in terms of our two speakers, I've got James Humphreys, who is Associate Policy Trainer for Global Government Forum, and also the Director of the Research and Engagement Consultancy Wood Newton. James was previously Head of Corporate Communications in the Prime Minister's Office, which included, while he was there, launching the first cross-government brand and the first mobile app for government. Prior to that, James was a civil servant, including in the Department of the Environment, and spent 2 years based in Brussels as Environment Attaché at the UK representation to the European Union. And he's written a book based on his experience in that role called Negotiating in the European Union, How to Make the Brussels Machine Work for You. So James has real insight from kind of the centre of government departments and kind of across the whole of the government machine about how things get done. And then we've also got Richard Johnstone here, who is Executive Editor for Global Government Forum. Richard is the editor where he produces analysis and insight for our audience of public servants all around the world. And before joining GGF, Richard spent nearly 5 years at the UK-based title Civil Service World, latterly where he was acting editor there, and he's worked in public policy journalism throughout his career. So as I say, two great experts. They're going to help us kind of make our way through this issue, but please do send in any questions, any comments that you have at any point in the webinar. So first things first, Richard, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to ask, can you give us a sense then, right at the beginning, starting with that policy process, how is policy developed? How do you kind of take an idea, that initial proposal, and work it up to something that is ready to be introduced into Parliament for scrutiny?
Great, thanks, Siobhan, and good morning, everybody. As that picture just showed of Keir Starmer on his battle bus, we've just lived through in the UK what I think most people would associate in their heads with the policy-making process, which is a general election. And in this process, political parties develop their policy proposals, and those that are voted into government get to put them into practice. Some of that is in legislation, and some of that is in the bits of the powers that government has to act without legislation. And we are seeing that now. We'll cover the legislative process later, but we've already had a King's Speech, which set out, I think, 39 bills. There's lots of different ways whether you count what counts as a bill. Some of the bills in the King's Speech are named as bills, and some of them are named as draft bills. But I think my tally was 39. I don't know if James has a different one that he might alight on later.
I did read
Uh,
40, but I guess as you
yes,
said,
exactly.
better.
There's
Yeah.
different tallies. Um, uh, and so those bills in the King's Speech are this early in the Parliament implementing the ideas that Labour had developed in its manifesto. So there's, I think the ones that are kind of furthest on in the parliamentary stages so far are the powers of the expanding the powers of the Office for Budget Responsibility, establishing Great British Energy, and giving the government power to nationalise passenger rail services. Those are already being taken forward, and James will be speaking about the legislative process they go through shortly. But that's probably as clean as this kind of policy making process gets. But obviously, in a country like the UK, where elections only take place every 4 or 5 years, much of the work of policy development happens outside of elections and is therefore a bit less of a linear process. And to crudely and badly paraphrase Howard Wilson, events will arise, dear boy, and the government will decide to or be compelled to act. So there might be an international treaty that requires legislation, or there's some criminal offence committed that Parliament decides needs legislation on tougher sentencing, or a scandal that requires greater financial regulation. Broadly speaking, those aren't things that would necessarily be in a party's manifesto from 3 years previously, but they will be things that the government will need to deal with. And how they do that, of course, is guided by their own political instincts and their philosophy, as well as what the Prime Minister wants to happen as the kind of head of the government. And that will, of course, be melded with advice from officials on what is achievable, what has been implemented previously, what the current kind of situation is, and where progress can be made. Civil servants do have a very important role. Therefore, the information they provide and the feedback to ministers on how their ideas can be implemented is critical, and that's something that we'll kind of touch on, I think, in today's conversation. In the jargon, the advice from civil servants to ministers is typically called a submission, and this can cover a lot of things. In a department, let's use the Department for Transport as an example. I've already mentioned the powers around effective rail nationalisation. When the government moves ahead with a policy like that, these submissions will cover things like the legislation that's needed to achieve this aim, and indeed whether it can be achieved without primary legislation, the capacity in the department that will be directed towards implementation, the aspects of the proposed law or action that interact with other parts of the public sector, and the organisations that will need to be consulted on the actions, both within the public sector and in the broader economy, and their likely responses. There will also be things like cost-benefit analysis produced as part of the kind of policy development process, and appraisals under Treasury guidance. There's two particular pieces of Treasury guidance that you'll hear coming up a lot in these conversations. Managing public money is the overall Treasury guidance for government spending that mandates things around probity and making sure that the money is correctly allocated with parliamentary consent, as well as getting into things like value for money. And then there is the Treasury Green Book, which is more focused on cost-benefit analysis and allocating spending around specific projects. In terms of that consultation, again, there are a few different ways that government can solicit feedback pre-legislation being introduced. Uh, there are green papers and white papers, and those are um, kind of published at different stages before legislation is formally introduced. Green papers are consultative documents with the aim of getting people to respond to a kind of outline policy idea, whereas white papers are one step closer to legislation. These are kind of set out as intents of how government um, will take action and are often published, including the kind of draft of the legislation itself. And again, these are both intended to provide information for interested and affected groups to solicit their responses um, at, as early in the legislative process as possible. I don't think we've seen any of these from the new government yet. I could be wrong in that, but when I looked at the Parliament website, I didn't see any. And again, that's partly because of that process that I mentioned. The government has its kind of policy priorities set out, whereas
Mm.
it might be seeking that kind of consultation later in the Parliament when you're kind of responding to an issue that has come up. And yeah, we'll kind of touch on this, I think, throughout the session as well. But the other area to touch on in terms of consultation is post-legislative consultation. Once you have an Act of Parliament, legislation in broad strokes is about giving government the power to act in a
Mm.
defined way, and the legislation will set out this kind of details behind that power, but often not how it will be deployed or how the government will act or exactly who it will interact with when it takes these actions. This is often done in what's called secondary legislation, and then there's a kind of consultation process that follows around that too.
Thanks, Richard. So we'll definitely come on to post legislation when we get to that point of the process. But just to pick up on a couple of things. So firstly, I just want to, Adrian has said he missed the first two webinars. Is it possible to listen to them again? Yes, Adrian, we will resend the link. They're all on the Global Government Forum website. You can watch those again. So we'll share the link with you and others for those. But on this issue then of a policy submission, so you set out there all of the things or some of the things that typically would be included in a submission from civil servants to ministers when they're thinking about new legislation. One of the things that struck me is how many things you mentioned there need to go in. So who might be affected, what legislation might be needed, the cost benefit analysis. One thing I remember as a civil servant myself is we were told a good submission should be 1 page long. So it's quite it's quite difficult to get all of that in. And I think then they came up with a formula which is 1 page the highlights, then 4 page most of what you put, and then I think there was a up to 40 pages of other information. But thinking about a minister, they get quite a few of these submissions. So when you see ministers with their boxes going home, that's what they're full of, all of these kind of submissions. And just before we move on to the legislative process itself, so a couple of things. You said the consultation at this stage, so a green paper, Richard. Would those be found on departmental websites? So if we've got members of our audience here today, maybe from the private sector, maybe other departments who want to maybe get involved in early consultation, are those green papers, when they're published, would they be found on government department websites and then the white papers more on the kind of Parliament websites? Is that right?
Yes, I believe they would probably both sit on departmental websites, or at least there would be links to them. If you go onto a departmental website on gov.uk, you will see on the homepage there is a number of different categories. There's always one that says news and communications, and that's where I always look first for what they're kind of releasing to the media. But there is always one that is a section called guidance and regulation, which will set out some of this. And there's usually a policy papers and consultations and research and statistics. So each government publishes an awful lot of stuff
Mm.
on gov.uk. And yeah, in terms of early legislation, and indeed the stuff we'll get into later about the legislation and the consultation that comes once an Act of Parliament has gained royal assent will feature on departmental websites.
Thanks, Richard. And just a couple of things, then I'm going to come on to you, James, for the legislative process. So a couple of things I noticed when I was doing a bit of background for this webinar is in terms of consultation, lots of departments seem to be publishing their own guidance on how you consult as kind of fully as possible. So there's kind of open policy making toolkits. And as you say, it's not a kind of clear linear process. It's a bit messy. And I think different departments are trialing different ways of making sure that they bring in groups, communities, individuals. But one of the things that I did notice in there, which I think wasn't there a few years ago or many years ago when I left, was the consideration of kind of digital and data implications. So how might this policy ultimately be delivered in a digital fashion? That's obviously something that's been brought in over the last few years. So just to say, I think the policymaking process is evolving all the time, and the way government consults is evolving all the time. So
Yeah,
it's definitely
just
worth
on
keeping an eye.
on that, I think it's the German government that has a mandate now that all departments will need to set out a in any legislation information on digital delivery. That's one of the things the government departments are told to do
Yeah.
before they publish legislation. I don't think we are quite there yet. So how much departments do on that side kind of will vary from case to case. But I think it's definitely heading in that direction where you obviously all legislation they'll think about how to deliver it, but that they kind of primarily think of how to deliver it digitally is definitely a
Yeah.
place we're going to end up.
And in the cost benefit analysis in the Green Book, there will be considerations around what's the impact on the environment, what's the impact on equality, and the government can put in other priorities as part of that kind of process as well. Thanks so much, Richard. So any questions that you have, if you're listening on the policy process, please do send them in and we will get to those. But James, I'm also going to ask you now to take us through. So ministers have had all of these policy submissions. They've kind of decided they like a particular area enough to want to try and get this into legislation. Can you talk us through that next stage? How does it go from deciding this is a priority through Parliament and then ultimately making new legislation?
Yes, of course. And I think perhaps the first thing to say is that the process is very complicated, but the bones of it are actually relatively straightforward and sort of maybe what you would expect. So one thing is you've got ministers running departments. Yes, they're all part of the same government. Yes, maybe they're all sitting in cabinet. They're all, chums together, but then they're not because they've got departmental responsibilities. So they also act individually. So how do you square off the fact they'll all be clamoring to get the bills through into legislation to show, that they're delivering on their departmental responsibilities? And so there is a committee that takes each of the, if you like, bids from the departments for the legislation they're going to put through. As Richard said, obviously, in this stage, where we're coming off the back of an election with a manifesto, it feels a little bit different because, if you like, those political priorities were set in that pre-election and election phase. But as a general principle, you have a committee that sits down and goes, how important is this to us and how difficult is it going to be to get it through? Because there's very limited capacity in Parliament to push legislation through, and you also don't want difficult opposition. There'll always be people opposed, but how bad is it? Are you going to have a backbench rebellion, your own people turning on you, as we have seen recently? So you're making those calculations, and there's not a simple way because each of the bills is different, has a different calculation. But essentially, they then pull out how much legislative time and how many bills do we think we can get through, and what sequence? Because if you put through something really controversial, it will eat up time and prevent some of your other measures. So it's a very also very human, because you're having to trust what individual ministers are saying about how easily it will go through. And if they, oh yeah, it'll be fine. And of course, actually, it gets bogged down in lots and lots of sort of battles in committee stages, and we'll come on to that. So my
So
old
when you said
department.
there's a committee that kind of decides, is that at the Parliamentary Business and Legislation Committee. Is that the one?
Yes, it is, but I think it's also and so that is worth having in mind. But there's also, if you like, all the conversations and assumptions that go on around it. So as I can say, one of my old department, which is now called Communities and Local Government, always had a terrible reputation for putting out half-baked legislation that then needed amending through the process. So if they came in with a bid saying, "Oh, we think we'll need, 8 days in committee," people would then be going, "Well, I bet it's 10 or 12." So there's a lot of those kind of intangibles, and of course they're all going on behind the scenes. It's very difficult to get to this bit of the system, but there are still ways we can intervene, and we'll have a look at those, I'm sure, in a minute.
And then, so once the committee decides which bills are going to go forward, is that what goes into the King's Speech? Is that what we see in the King's Speech?
It is, but what's also on is they've gone, right, what order are we going to put them in, and what priority are we going to give them? And so the sense of how much time and effort they're going to take to go through.
Great. So once you have this, and then you have the King's Speech, what happens then? Talk us through a bill actually going through those different stages in Parliament.
Right. So deep breath all round. And I think we may have a slide that can help on this, which hopefully isn't too alarming. Essentially, a bill goes through 5 stages, and each one of them is intended to do something different. It gets a bit complicated because also the bill has to go through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The process is broadly the same in each, and we won't get into where it's slightly different. That really would get too painful. So that if you think of them as basically, it's got to go through a 5-stage process in one, and then a 5-stage process in the other. And here's the trick: you can start them in the House of Lords or in the House of Commons. Mainly they start in the Commons, but there are bills that will start in the Lords. So if we then think we only need to take one of these 4 boxes and look at it, not all 4, and essentially you've got these 5 stages. So the first reading is a formality. It's just the government going, here's our new bill, and Parliament in about 5 seconds goes fine, and that means it's published and it's out there in the system, if you like. Second reading is, if you like, the first go at the people in favour of the bill and the potential opposition to get on a stage and say their piece at a relatively high level. So this is a debate in the House, either Commons or Lords, in the chamber. The government's presenting it, it's setting out why. People will speak in opposition, and it could be totally principled opposition about the whole thing, or it could be saying, well, yes, we agree with this, but we've got to worry about how it would apply to particular groups. So to take an example, and I've chosen an old one, the Dogs Fouling of Land Act, 1996. So this is the legislation that would enable, now enables, a local authority to fine you if your dog performs in the wrong place and you don't clear up after it. So that's the piece of legislation that gives the power to local authority to do that. Now that is something where some of the opposition was saying, well, we're fine. Yeah, we don't mind you doing that, but we've got specific concerns or worries. So an MP might speak on that in the chamber. They're not opposing the whole thing, but they're signaling this is a concern that will need to be discussed, and perhaps minor changes to the legislation, the draft. And that's where the committee stage comes in. So I think, again, we might have a picture of a committee stage in action, but essentially this is a smaller group of MPs who are going to sit down and they will go through that legislation literally line by line, clause by clause, and they will have a discussion on, do they accept it or do they think it needs to be amended? So with the Dogs Fouling of Land Act 1996, one of the concerns expressed was by the hunting community, who said, if we're hunting on land and our dogs foul that land, could we be prosecuted? So they signalled that concern and sort of insisted at committee stage that the legislation was amended to make clear this was not going to be used as a backdoor way of banning hunting. So you get those sort of concerns. They weren't against the bill as a whole, but they had something, they were worried about it. And that, of course, we can all do that. If a bill comes forward, you either find an MP who will speak against it, or when it comes to that committee stage, you try and persuade an MP on the committee to raise this issue and try and get the legislation amended.
And really interesting, because you meant in that example that you gave, a very specific group had a very specific concern. So again, for our audience, once you're in this kind of parliamentary process, is there still opportunities then for potential stakeholders, people who might be impacted or want to influence, to be able to get their views into the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it can go both ways. So to take another example, again, a sort of fairly routine piece of legislation, or the legislation that enables local authorities, for example, to issue a fine against noisy neighbours. Now, that was where the consultation process that Rachel was discussing, that included the environmental health people in councils who were going to be doing this, the people running night noise patrols, going around and trying to stop parties from being too loud. They said, love the idea of a fixed penalty notice. We think the most appropriate level would be about £60. But in committee stage, there was a big campaign by the Daily Mail, who were big back then, maybe still are, on noisy neighbours from hell, saying, oh, this isn't enough, it needs to be a lot higher. So the value was increased considerably. And that's where something the environmental health people weren't very happy about, that, because they thought it was less likely people would pay the fine on the spot and more likely would end up in court and cause a lot of extra paperwork and hassle and get the courts clogged up. So that's something where they thought it was all fine because they'd been consulted by the department and they'd got what they wanted in the bill. But at committee stage, ministers, in fact, and because other MPs were picking up on the Daily Mail's concerns, changed that to increase the basic fine. So yeah, you've got to, perhaps if you're interested, there's two things. There's trying to change it the way you want it, but also trying to protect it and make sure it's not changing the way you don't want. And both of those come in at the committee stage.
And those, if you're interested in a particular piece of legislation and you think you might have a kind of stake in that piece of legislation, you can go onto the Parliament website, is that right? And there will be kind of opportunities to send in your views through the Parliament website.
Well, it's more in practical terms, it is getting the ear of members of that committee. Okay. And also they are open. You can go and sit. So that photograph we were looking at, there'll be, let's face it, not many people go, but you will often see interested groups will have somebody they've sent along to just sit there and kind of absorb it. And then, yes, afterwards they might go up to an MP and go, oh, I wondered if I could have a word. I'm from the, pro hunting lobby, or I'm from the, the manufacturers of large audio equipment used for parties. I'm concerned about this legislation. Can I just explain my views? Could we have a meeting? Could I write to you? So there's an awful lot of that lobbying going on to try and influence, and so that message will then be raised by an MP, because only they can make the amendments. And that's within the committee, they're then going to vote on it. So a single MP has then got to persuade others to vote in the same way and get that amendment made.
So I'm going to come back to you, James, on the completion of that process and what happens then. But we've got a question from Peter, which I think we need to answer first before we get to that. I really like this question because Peter says, I'm interested in policy formation that crosses more than one ministry. Is the Cabinet Office responsible for coordinating the final policy outcome? And when you think about it, most policy areas, I think, will cross more than one department. There are very few, I think, policy areas that don't. So, Richard, your thoughts on who coordinates cross-departmental policies and legislation as it needs to go through?
Yes, I almost mentioned that when we were talking about submissions, and it's a very good point to raise. So when the policy is being developed, there will be what are known as write rounds. So there will be a lead department for a piece of legislation, but through cabinet, more likely through cabinet committees, they will identify the areas that crosses into other departmental responsibilities, or there's an area they want departments to help them with, and there will be write rounds to those departments, basically sharing the policy, and then those responses from departments will be collated by the lead department, who will work out kind of where and when the responses will affect the legislation. So it's a balance really between the Cabinet Office as the kind of the coordinating bit of government. So they would help do a lot of the facilitation of those connections, and the lead department, and that balance can shift really as a function of political priority.
Mm.
If the Prime Minister is prioritising an issue, then the Cabinet Office will be more involved in chasing it up. Whereas if there's an issue that's more of a slightly routine matter, then the lead department will kind of take that responsibility. We've just published some research, Global Government Forum, on that we've titled "Making Government Work," which has interviewed 12 of the most senior civil servants in governments around the world to highlight the kind of challenges that they currently face. And one of the things that came out on of that research, and I will just share it with everyone, was the need to get these cross-government systems working well, and the need to prioritize them and to fund them so that that policy making does happen, and that COVID in particular proved the necessity of the centre in that. Rather, some governments started trying to deal with COVID as in the health ministry, but it quickly outgrew the health ministry. But there was a little bit of time lost in kind of responding to that in some governments. So yeah, those getting those systems right is absolutely vital. But exactly where it lies is slightly a term of art, and that's slightly based on the kind of political priority. And it will be very interesting to watch, for example, as Labour tries to implement its 5 national missions. Those are kind of definitionally big cross-cutting government projects. They are, in Labour's telling of it, 2-term ambitions that will require extremely long-term policy making and long-term coordination. We are expecting boards to be formed to lead those. Those will be half creatures of lead departments and half creatures of the centre. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Labour decides to structure government to kind of deliver their missions. I think that will reveal a lot on kind of what works best if progress is made.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. You're absolutely right in terms of the ability to join up is one of the biggest challenges, I think, facing governments all around the world, because they're these historic silos that departments work in. But James, I want to bring it back to like the legislation point of view. If a piece of legislation very obviously has a big impact on more than one department, when they're pulling together the bill team, for example, that will work, civil servants and lawyers on taking this through Parliament, would they bring in officials from more than one department to work on that bill team together?
Yes, I mean, it may, for operational reasons, mean that one department would formally lead on it, for all sorts of reasons. But yes, essentially that can happen. Perhaps it should happen an awful lot more. But so, for example, the government may at some point legislate on fit notes on the way in which you handle people who are off work because they're ill, and the advantages of helping people to get back to work. That's already a joint team between Department of Health and Social Care and the Department of Work and Pensions. So yeah, that's a sort of thing where you expect that bill, there would be officials from both working very closely on it. But as Richard said, that's not that common, and certainly there's advantages the more it happens.
Thanks. Thomas is having to leave us, but said he will catch up through the website, and this has been incredibly useful. So if you're still there, Thomas, thank you. We will, as I say, send a link to all of them as we go through. Reynold, I'm going to come to your question in a moment, but James, I do want to just finish off the legislative process. So once it's done these kind of the various readings, what's the final stage of legislation? How does it get kind of completed and that's it? It's then in law.
Right. Well, there are a couple more stages. So it's been in that in a committee. It then goes back to the whole House. Effectively, at that point, the House is going to look at what those amendments have been specifically. Does the House as a whole feel comfortable with those? And also, it will then take in this third reading that's the final sign off. But then it goes to the other chamber and goes through the whole process again. And there's a final stage in which the views of one chamber need to then be accepted by the other, and so there's this consideration of amendments process. Sometimes it's called ping pong if the Lords and the Commons keep knocking it back and forth, and it's at the end of that process that you've got your bill becomes an act because it has royal assent. And then it's almost done at that stage. But you will also see that sometimes, firstly, the bill has to have a date for coming into force, and that may be in the future, and it may not be set, and it can be changed, and also that it may involve secondary legislation.
Right.
So this is where there will be further further actions, if you like statutory instruments that will do some of the really crunchy detail. And again, those can be influenced and shaped through consultation or indeed through processes in Parliament. So yeah, the sort of that's like I say, it is very complicated, but the basics of it are
Bones. Yeah.
open to being influenced from the outside.
One of the things that certainly I am, when I watch kind of the news, you quite often hear the frustration of ministers in the Commons saying the Lords are holding this up. And that ping pong process seems to last quite a long time. Can you just explain a little bit? If it's been in the King's speech, meaning it's in this session, which is usually a year of Parliament, does that ping pong process have to be completed within that session? And can the Lords then ultimately prevent a bill from coming into force? Do they have the power to do that, even though they're not the elected part of our Parliament?
That they do, and they're supposed to. I mean, they're the reason for having them and paying them £300 a day and the rest of it is they are a brake on a Commons going slightly crazy and doing something it really shouldn't do. And so if on the big picture, their job is to either make amendments to try and improve the quality of legislation, or to go, look, we are so worried about this, we want it held over. We don't think, you need to go away and think again. If you think again and you come back next year, we won't stop it again. So that they can do that, but only once,
Right.
and they can't do it on every kind of legislation. So by convention, they can't do it on the budget. So there are limits, but it is intended that they do have this process for delaying and for if you're asking Parliament to think again.
Right. And David has asked on that note, just to clarify, because I think I know the answer to this, but is it the same committee and people for the Commons and the House of Lords, or are there two groups that need to be interacted with? So I think they mean is there one civil service kind of bill team that interacts with two different committees in the House of Lords and the House of Commons?
Yes, although the bill team that's put together in a department, there'd be very, very little chance to get to them or influence them. So they're really behind the scenes. If you were meeting them and having a drink with them, and yeah, great. Although I'm sure they'd be very professional and not be too influenced. But yes, they're the same people in the department would be dealing with both chambers of the House. But if you're thinking about who you would influence, yes, you would want to be influencing lords who may, either speak in the chamber, or if there's, they're going through the legislation line by line. Again, important to be able to do that.
Thanks. And I think I read somewhere there's a slight distinction, I think, in that the committee in the House of Commons is a set group of people. They decide who that committee is, and it's that committee that will see that bill through. In the Lords, I think I'm right, I would have to double check this, but any Lord can turn up at any point to talk about that particular piece of legislation in committee, I think.
Yeah, and it does come to, I think, one of the slight myths about the House of Lords. So it's often said, oh, it's marvelous because it's got all this expertise, and look at the number of amendments they make to legislation. But a lot of those amendments are actually handed out. So there's this phrase handout amendments. They're handed out by the department who
Right.
mucked it up first time round in drafting to get the thing out because they had a slot in the legislative programme. And then they've gone and done more consultation, realised the bill isn't drafted properly, and they're asking a Lord or an MP who's on there, like, could you go and put this down?
They're using the system that way.
Yeah, and the same way that Lords, they'll be broadly supportive, but those amendments may well have been drafted by people outside. So if you're a lobby group, you will be literally drafting and handing over to an MP or a Lord. Will you make this amendment? Here's the wording which our lawyers think will do the job. Because the risk is if you make an amendment that the clerks in Parliament, how they go, this isn't going to work as law, then it will not be able to be taken forward. So you have to make sure you're not just saying, oh, could you make it better this way? It's always better to have some wording which a lawyer has looked at, and you're pretty confident that it will make sense within the meaning of within the bill.
Thanks, James. So we've got to the stage, we've got our royal assent, and as you say, there'll be a date on that piece of legislation then for when it may come into force. And in a moment, I'm going to ask both of you for what happens then, because in some ways, that's what the public then feel is when this law comes into force. But Reynolds got an interesting question, which is about how transparent I think this process is. That's how I'm interpreting this question. So, at all stages, accountability and the maintenance of evidence of, for example, decisions that have been taken in this process is critical. How good do you think the creation and keeping of necessary records is? So how good are kind of government officials, government, in Parliament, how good are they at keeping records? And I think there's a different process in Parliament. I think there's a very particular process for how they record what happens in Parliament to maybe how policy decisions are taken in government departments. Richard, I'll come to you and then James on this. So how good do you think we are at keeping records in government of decisions that have been taken?
Um, it's one of those things where it's at an individual level, I think civil servants are quite good at that as they get to know a policy area and they guide legislation through Parliament, and they understand the stakeholders and things like that. But at the institutional level, knowledge management in the civil service is always something that people are looking to improve, because civil servants move around often in their career. So the institutional knowledge is rarely held for any particularly long period of time in the individual, so it needs to be held kind of collectively in the department. I think they struggle with that, and it is something that I know government have long focused on. It's how can we manage the knowledge that we have as a collective and keep it up to date. In terms of the kind of record of decisions, yes, of course, Parliament has Hansard and things like that. We can always see who votes which way on the various stages of legislation that James mentioned. In terms of the kind of political decision making around which bits of legislation go forward, any kind of contentious discussions in cabinet and things like that, those are confidential, and those are the kind of things that we will find out under the kind of 30-year Rule Act and things like that, when you read stories always around New Year that are released from the National Archives when things pass a certain threshold. So there's political discussions that we know happen when one looks at the practicalities of legislation, but the kind of specifics of those discussions, well, you can read leaks in the newspapers, I'm sure, but the kind of civil service notation of a lot of those political discussions at cabinet level will be the kind of things that we will that won't be published publicly, at least for a long time.
Thanks. Yeah, James, you quite often hear, don't you? I'm following on from Reynolds' questions. You quite often hear, say, opposition calling for the publication of legal advice, for example, on something that the government is doing, or the publication of a policy submission, policy advice. But those things traditionally, as Richard said, aren't published. The argument being there might be sensitive information in those.
Yeah, and it is a difficult area because if in a way, the more that you take formal documents like that and say they should be made available or could be made available, both the government disclosing them or say in a future public inquiry, the risk is it drives some of this stuff underground. So they just have a chat. And that thing of which technology has made this perhaps more obvious, although in the olden days you could still sort of go, I'll just write that on a post-it note, peel it off and destroy it at the end of it. If you not that I ever did, but I wouldn't say just put it all on technology. Right back over years, governments do not always commit things to paper, and never did. And so you're always going to have these conversations. So I think perhaps it comes in most clearly where the government is really relying on something. So it's not that they've had legal advice and thought about it and are acting. They're going, we've got legal advice and it's telling us this. it naturally invites people to say, well, okay, but can we have a look at it? Because our lawyers are not sure about that. And then, so I think a lot of the time it's because government is actually sort of slightly pulling the curtain back itself because it wants to use that for its own advantage. And then that actually invites people to say, well, if that's the case, let's see the
Yeah.
evidence.
Thanks. And I think your point on technology is really interesting because we've seen, I think, over the last couple of years, WhatsApp, for example, the conversations that have been carried out on WhatsApp between ministers and people being asked to provide those for evidence in reviews, for example. And are they the official account? Are they not the official account? To what extent should that be taken into account in part of these reviews? It's throwing up all these grey areas, I think, these new channels of communication between people as well. But also, as Richard said, there's still, despite all of this new technology, it always surprises me, there's still every cabinet meeting, you have the cabinet secretary sat next to the prime minister, handwritten notes, and they become the official record of cabinet. But as Richard said, they're not then released for, I think, 30 or 40 years after that cabinet discussion. Fantastic. Great questions that were coming in. Please keep those coming in. But now the final section that we're getting onto, but if you've got any questions on anything, please do keep them coming in. The final section then is, once we have legislation, once that legislation has gained royal assent and it comes into law, there's then a whole nother process that kicks off in terms of what does that mean? How does it get delivered on the ground? And that really involves hundreds and hundreds of different organizations, groups, people part of the kind of ecosystem of getting these policies delivered on the ground. I'm going to come to you first, Richard, and then you, James, just for your thoughts. And can you give us a sense of what might happen with a new piece of legislation and how that plays out then in terms of ultimately making a difference to people's lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, once the legislation is passed, that is when the government has the power to act. But that it's not quite a kind of linear process of kind of that will be the moment that the department will start thinking about it. They will have been thinking about their plans for implementation and how they might deliver this policy area much further in advance. So it might be there's lots of different things to take into account here in terms of how a department might deliver a policy, what resources it will put towards it. The legislation might create a new public body. You can tell I've been involved in the creation of these slides because I got trains and buses into it, but we just saw a train there in terms of the public ownership of passenger rail services bill. Once that passes, there's another piece of legislation that will create an organisation called Great British Railways, and that will kind of integrate train and track. So there's kind of concurrent pieces of legislation that are going on at the moment, and the Department for Transport, the Rail Directorate there, is thinking about how those will all fit together, how those will all join up, as well as planning for the kind of practical process of what happens when train services are nationalised. What's the schedule for when current franchises expire? How do they work with different franchises ahead of time to get the information they need to transfer services over? And maybe different companies, different stakeholders will have a different approach on this. And those might be kind of informal conversations in some cases. And then down to kind of how IT systems can merge with those of the department and things like that as services transfer over. So it's not quite that at the moment of royal assent, the policy teams get on with it, but it's not like that either, if you know what I mean. There will be stuff that they can do ahead of time, but there'll be stuff that they can only do once they have the legal power to do it. And then this is also true in terms of some of the relationships with other parts of the public sector. So obviously we have devolution in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. It's easiest to discuss Scotland and Wales when you come to devolution because the systems are relatively similar. Northern Ireland has got different powers and different systems, but the UK government can legislate on issues that are reserved. So there is a reserved list in the legislation that established the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh, what's now the Welsh Parliament, that are issues that the UK government can legislate on. But the UK government can ask the devolved parliaments for their permission to legislate in areas that are devolved to them. And if the Scottish Parliament or Welsh Assembly provide that legislative consent, then that can apply. And in the case of the rail nationalisation bill, that power is being sought because the franchise regulations that exist since the legislation was passed in 1992 apply across all of the UK. So they are looking for that power, those powers. I think they will successfully get them. But sometimes asking for those legislative consent motions can be politically fraught. It's an issue that comes up in Scottish politics fairly regularly of whether they should give those powers to Westminster. And then, of course, there is the consultation with the ministers and their teams at the devolved assemblies about, well, this legislation has passed now, we are going to act in this way. Do you want to act in a coordinated way with us, with the various stakeholders who will often also be cross-border? In terms of working with local government, I think the picture is a bit muddier than that, because local government does not have the same defined legal basis in the UK as devolved assembly, the devolved parliaments do. So the government isn't under quite the same obligation to consult with them and work with them on the implementation. If there's a topic that's going to have a big impact on local government, like the planning changes that it sounds like Labour is keen to implement, for example, then there'll be a team in government, most likely based in the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, as it's now been rebranded, that will consult with the Local Government Association, the umbrella group of local councils in England, and then the LGA, as the kind of voice of the sector, will kind of disseminate through its networks. But you mentioned, Siobhan, that I've covered public policy throughout my career. I used to cover local government, and I know just how often councils are frustrated by getting policies, as far as they can see it, dropped on their doorstep by central government. I always think the most egregious one is that the local government funding settlement is rather famously almost always published on the last sitting day of Parliament before Christmas. So poor local government finance directors, who I used to work very closely with, have a massive entry when they come back from the Christmas break, working out how much money they've got to spend and setting their budgets and kind of working out the likely impact of that and all the scrutiny that they have to do at a local level if they close services and things like that. So there's a lot of that kind of consultation that goes on, and a lot of the delivery in departments is about setting up the teams to do that consultation, as well as setting up the teams to actually, get on and deliver stuff. And that might be something that fits neatly into existing departmental teams. If the government does make big changes to planning, for example, the Ministry of Housing will have a planning team that will take on vast bulk of that work. Or it might be something like the taking nationalisation of rail services, which probably will involve the creation of another new directorate or agency to kind of provide the guiding mind on things like that.
Thanks, Richard. And James, listening to what Richard said there, I imagine this is why when you look on kind of government websites and department websites, the policy process is often seen as a circle, because ideally you want all of the people who might be involved in the delivery of this policy to have been involved from the start. It's like a circle that never ends, because they're involved in it so that as it goes through, they're thinking about how will this be delivered. And they're also part then of the evaluation once it is being delivered to improve the policy for the next stage of development. So any of your thoughts on how people are kind of brought in? But also, I imagine at this point, again, for our audience, this is where public procurement might kick in that the government will be looking to bring in partners to help them deliver some of these new policies.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think if coming at it from the point of view of procurement, obviously you right from that first time that the draft bill is published and going through Parliament. I mean, these things are visible on the
Mm,
horizon, very, very sort of chugging forward, and you can then start to think, oh, there will be a contract to
mm,
assist the integration of different computer systems within the rail sector. And if you are a contractor who does that kind of thing, you know that's coming. You've got a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like. You'll have a sense of the budget, because also the legislative process has in mind the fact this will need to be funded.
mm.
Not every bill has a significant cost element to it. So the one I mentioned about dogs fouling land,
Very different from GB Rail.
exactly. So one of those, the Treasury is not too worried about. The other one, it will be all over, because what
Yeah.
you write into that legislation will then have an effect on how much it costs to implement and the running costs and the obligations that go with that. So yeah, definitely in terms of procurement, it can also make it frustrating where the timing is left vague, and you do have pieces of legislation that are enacted and then just are not and do not enter into force.
Yeah.
And that is a slightly bizarre thing, but there are often political reasons why that might be. I mean, the Irish Language Act is one that's been in limbo arguably over 20 years, but that's where it's been enacted. It just hasn't been implemented. So you do get these curiosities as well.
Mm,
But once for most legislation, once it's rolling, it does have a pretty predictable timeline, and that is also, we know that, as Richard said, a new organisation is not necessarily. There will have been a lot of groundwork, but all the, right, it's going to have a board. We've got to appoint a chair. We're going to get the board members on board. We've got to find a building for it. We've got to get the HR team in.
mm,
Someone's got to buy some desks. I mean, there is government is not. I mean, it's made some steps in terms of having hubs. That deal with some of the practical sides of getting new organisations up and running. The idea that you could just like the civil governments could just move over and start next Monday.
mm.
It doesn't still really work like that, and there's an awful lot of that prep that has to be put into place. But yeah, with that context, it's pretty predictable when the legislation will get turned into purchase orders.
Mm. Yeah, really interesting what you said there. So not only for suppliers will there be implications of delivering out to the public some of these, some of what the new legislation is bringing into force, but there will also be machinery of government changes that will require departments or organisations to realign themselves, and that will require kind of new digital infrastructure as well, which I think there is procurement issues that arise from those changes as well. So it's definitely worth, as partners with government, keeping an eye on what might this mean both internally and externally, this new piece of legislation.
Yes, and it often starts with research, because that's the thing. They've got to get the knowledge base to understand what it is that they're going to do in terms of the implementation. And then after that, so
Yeah.
for example, at the moment, you'd see an awful lot that's going on about the energy sector because of the changes coming in there. But a lot of that is research. How would we make this happen?
Yeah.
What would the remodeling of energy price fixed points in this sector? So a lot of that thing is going on, and that will then come through into some very, very big decisions in terms of the infrastructure that would fulfill higher targets in renewable energy.
Yeah. Thanks. We've got a little bit of time left. So now is your chance in the audience to send in any questions you have about anything. So the policy making process in Whitehall, anything that we haven't covered that you thought might come up in terms of how legislation is made in Parliament, but then also any questions that you've got about this area of delivery on the ground. And also we haven't really touched on evaluation, what happens there in terms of how policy gets evaluated. But while you're thinking about any questions that you might have, I just want to run through some of the opportunities that we have in Global Government Forum where you could get even more involved with kind of what we do and how we bring together organisations with officials. So we have a whole host of things that we run. So we've got, I think on the next slide, we run in person events, and I'll come on to some of those in the moment, but we do research. We can commission specific research on behalf of organisations. We do a load of training as well, and there are some specific courses which I'll highlight in a moment. We have our website and articles full of lots of information. We do interviews with key senior officials around the world, which can be really useful in terms of what the priorities are in different governments around the world. We do 2 different podcast series, again, where we bring together senior officials from the governments around the world or companies that are working with governments around the world on, in particular, some of the digital issues and challenges that are facing civil services around the world. And then we do a whole host of webinars, not like these ones traditionally, but more where we bring together kind of officials from different departments, different governments, with quite often with private sector partners as well to discuss particular issues. When it comes to some of our I think the next events that are coming up, these are great opportunities for partners, suppliers to get alongside senior officials in government. We've got our Public Service Data Live coming up in London on the 19th of September. This is the second time we've run this event. It was really great inaugural event last year where we had Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary. And I think this year we have got the head of the civil service coming to give keynote speech as well. So that is on the 19th of September. I think there's still opportunity to get involved in that one. All things to do with data, how it's managed, how it's shared, how it's stored, all of those issues, how it's being used to drive forward AI in government. So lots of things there in that one. And then going into next year, we've got our kind of flagship annual event, which is called Innovation. That's taking place on the 25th to the 26th of March in London next year. We get thousands of civil servants from across the country involved in that, and senior people from different governments, including the United States and Canada, flying in to speak in that one. So another great event. If you're interested in getting involved in any of those, we will send you these slides, but you can see we've got our contact on there for Matt Hoare, who is our media sales director on there. And then I did mention training. If you go on our website, we have a whole host of different training events that you can sign up to. Some of those more aimed at civil servants themselves, but there are a couple in particular. There's one on the 11th of December, a new course that we are putting on, all about understanding UK procurement and procurement legislation, which I think will be incredibly useful for some of the people who are on this call. It's a kind of mix of presentations, exercises, and discussions, but there's also an opportunity for a kind of individual surgery. So with you or your organisation, if you've got questions about procurement and what it might mean for your organisation, we've got an expert trainer leading that, who was the director of the procurement programmes for the UK National School of Government for 10 years. So that's a great opportunity for you. You do need to sign up to that one. There is a fee for that one, and there's limited places, but it's a really good one to flag for now. So that's just some of the things that we do. We've got some more questions coming in at the moment. So Adrian Williams has said, are civil servants planning the procurement process for new services before a bill is approved by Parliament, or do they have to wait? So I think, James, this was going back to what you were saying. Is it sequential, or do these things get kind of done as we go along through the process?
Yeah, so sometimes it can be a bit murky because there is this principle: government cannot do anything unless it has legal powers to do so, and almost all those legal powers come from legislation. So if you haven't legislated, what extent can you start spending money? And there are also, even if you think you can get away with it in terms of saying, well, it was, we do immigration, so yeah, we can start to think, well, we haven't actually got the right to put people on planes and send them somewhere, but we probably will have, so we've spent a little bit of money preparing the policy. So you can do a certain amount, but you may also be criticized for spending money that is then not used or is wasted. And so there is a certain amount of sort of wriggle room, but yeah, the principle is you shouldn't really be spending money unless unless you have the power to do so. And therefore, when you do, it's moving into a bit of a grey area. So the procurement can be planned, but they would be much more reluctant to actually start a formal process.
It is really tricky, isn't it? It's getting that balance right between, you want to move at speed because public sector quite often gets criticised for moving slowly, but you need to be really careful about how you spend public money. So it's kind of getting that balance right, as you say.
And just to jump in there, Siobhan, we saw that a lot during the Brexit process, when government wants to spend money that has not been delegated to it by Parliament, the permanent secretaries of departments need to ask for a written ministerial direction to do that. And we saw a whole kind of tranche of ministerial directions coming out in the Brexit process when the UK had not formally left the European Union. The legislation for Britain to do so had not passed Parliament, when we will all be able to remember the process that went through. But departments needed to prepare. They needed to spend money on the systems that HMRC would use at the border and things like that. And there was a lot of letters from permanent secretaries to ministers saying, "Can I get your approval?" Because ultimately the ministers are responsible to Parliament. "Can I get your approval for this spending?" And that was like a whole category of ministerial direction that was kind of invented around Brexit.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question in from Simon, Richard, which I'm going to put to you, from Simon Gillen, who said there's a colloquial saying that Whitehall does not like giving up power to local governments, etc. Is this an accurate critique, or should it be more that Westminster does not like giving up power, i.e. ministers and MPs rather than officials? Or do you think both are true or neither are true? So who's the real blocker here, Richard? Is it ministers or is it civil servants? And James, I'll come to you after for your thoughts on that.
So I think it's probably both true. My thinking about England being such a centralized nation is a long-standing issue, and I always think that it's difficult to quite untangle, but it comes down to a lot to kind of fear of postcode lotteries. Ministers just see trouble in there being more variety in local services, because they think when something goes bad, I bet we still get blamed for it, but if something goes well, I bet we don't get praised for giving them the powers. And I've heard ministers being quite harsh sometimes to local government in ways that I wasn't expecting about their capability. And there also seems to be worries about kind of local government capability that I don't always think are fair. So I think the kind of the wellspring of it is ministers and the kind of political concern and just the wariness to give up control. I also think civil servants are quite happy to go along with the grain of that quite a lot of the time, because they likewise don't like to give up power often to devolved administration. So it's the kind of thing that takes a lot of political effort to change, and we did see in the coalition government in particular, and the early Cameron majority government thereafter, quite a lot of effort from government to devolve, and those structures are now maturing in England and having more powers given to them. But often, always, as so much in the British state, comes down to the Treasury. And if you have a chancellor who is willing to devolve the money, because often the power follows the money, then you will get progress. And George Osborne, for a divisive political figure he may have been, he was committed to actually devolving money in a way that few holders of that office generally are. I don't think we quite know where Rachel Reeves lands on that yet.
Thanks, Richard. And just looking at the clock, James, the final word on this will come to you. So in terms of giving up power, who do you think is the most resistant to that?
Well, I think it is the government, and in a way, the lack of resistance is there's nothing in the constitution to stop government absorbing power higher and higher. So ministers will complain it goes to number 10. Officials will complain ministers and special advisors are getting too involved, and then local authorities, they'd be saying, well, we don't get any say in what goes on. So there's a gradual shift of power more and more to the centre, and you would need to have very, very firm, clear, devolved responsibilities for other bodies. Where you get that, it can stop, but otherwise, the risk is there's just an ongoing process, and everyone responsible for delivery on the front line feels more and more fed up with it.
It seems to me there's kind of two things going on. There's that wanting to bring everything into the centre, but at the same time, there's a lot more effort to trying to open up policy making to right down to grassroots levels and bringing kind of communities and individuals in a way that wasn't done before. And then we have, as Richard said, we've got all the new like mayoralties and all the regional structures in place, which should, you would think, lead to more devolution of power, but it's whether the money then flows through the system as well in the way that you want it to. We have sadly come to the end of our time. Thank you so much. Thanks to James and to Richard. Been a fascinating discussion. Thanks to the audience as well for sending in all of your questions. As I said, this was the third in what will be four ultimately webinars on how Whitehall and Westminster are working. And the next and final one of this series, we're going to be looking at how Labour is changing government. So it will be, I think, enough time since the general election to really look now at the difference that Labour is making based on, as Richard touched on there, its mission approach to kind of policy development and delivery. And that will take place on Tuesday, the 1st of October, and you can register as you did for this one on our website, and that's another free webinar for everybody. Thank you so much to all of you, and I look forward to seeing you again, hopefully on the 1st of October. Thanks, James. Thanks, Richard. See you later. Bye.